Okay, so today is today is September the 27th, and we're studying the last lesson for our third unit. This whole month we have been talking about Joseph and the love. The unit topic says struggles with love. So just want to just briefly go over the four lessons. The first lesson reveals how a lack of familiar love devolved into jealousy and destruction. In lesson two, it portrays Joseph's commitment to love that refuses to hold on to past wrongs, but rather seeks God's path to future success. And lesson three and four focuses pretty much on the same thing. It shows Joseph's brothers coming to Egypt and reveal how love and reconciliation can prevail in spite of harsh and negative circumstances. So, this lesson from last week and lesson today definitely shows us how we can still prevail in spite of how we may have been treated, in spite of the circumstances. If we trust God and hold on to God's unchanging hands, as we often say, then we will come out victorious, like the pastor said this morning. So, our lesson this morning, the topic is love prevails over all. The unifying topic is God's plan revealed. Our background lesson is actually coming from Genesis 43, the whole chapter of Genesis 43, and then 45, 1 through 15. Our lesson passage is coming from Genesis 45, 1 through 8, and then it goes to 10 through 15. Our lesson aim this morning is to show how one broken family was able to restore their relationships by having the courage to forgive and to walk in love. Our life aim is to demonstrate the love of God to all. So, we as Christians, we need to have this same courage. It says the courage to forgive and to walk in love, and then to demonstrate the love of God to all. If we are Christians, and Christians mean that we are um, following Christ, we are followers of Christ, and our goal is to live the life that Christ has taught and to show his love regardless. So I want to go to our introduction in our student's manual. The introduction says, love conquers all because God is love. So that's a mouthful right there. It tells you that love conquers all because God is love. So that means that God conquers all and love conquers all. And when love is applied to our life situations, nothing can withstand its power, not even bitterness and hatred. As Christians, we are not to master love, but be mastered by it. The acquiescing completely to its influence. When God's love rules over our heart, it purges the soul of the stains left behind by trauma, grief, hurt, and the pain of this life. It empowers us to love ourselves so we can love God and others in return. So, just that first paragraph lets us know that regardless of what type of grief we go through, what type of traumas we go through, whatever hurt or pain we go through in this life, because we will experience, if not all of those, we will experience the majority of those. But regardless of what we experience, love is the answer to it all. It empowers us to love ourselves so we can love God and others in return. The second paragraph goes on to say, this was the kind of love that conquered Joseph's heart. Judah made a passionate plea that Joseph keep him as opposed to Benjamin. After Joseph's silver cup was found in Benjamin's bag, after looking at his brothers, especially Benjamin, his mother's son, Joseph could no longer contain himself. The charade was over. He had to tell them who he was and hope he also could see his father in his old age. The third paragraph says, if ever there was a person who had a reason to hold a grudge, it was Joseph. Most people could not imagine a more horrible thing for a group of brothers to do than to sell their younger brother into slavery. Joseph prevailed by the hand of God through the various trials and rough patches he dealt with while separated from his family. Joseph did not lose himself through his travails, and as a result, the love God imparted into him enabled him to be a blessing to his family. He simply wanted to be with his family and leave the past behind. So that lets you know that Joseph truly loved his family. And first of all, Joseph loved God. And today, again, as was mentioned in our service this morning, that with the Holy Spirit in us, then we should be able to exemplify the love of God because the Holy Spirit is God and he lives in us. So we should be able, if we focus on love and if we focus on God and move self out of the way, then we should be able to put the past behind us and to move forward in loving our spiritual family as well as Joseph did loving his natural family. So last week's lesson ended with Genesis 42 and 25. And that verse says, Joseph then gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to return every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. This was done for them. So a lot happened between that last verse and where we are going to begin today with Genesis 45, 1 through 8. And if you all know me as a teacher, I always like to bring everyone up to date to where I am. So I don't want to leave anybody behind. So I just want to recap a couple of things that happened from that last verse up into where we will start this morning or this afternoon. The first point I like to mention is that the brothers were not to return without Benjamin. We know that the brothers showed up in Egypt to get grain, but Joseph, whom they did not know was their brother, was told that the only way that they could return so that they could get their brother that was being held was if they came with Benjamin. This would verify, if they brought Benjamin back with them, this would verify their words. And their words were that they were honest men and they were not spies, because Joseph kept telling them that they were spies. The other thing, the brothers discover money as they're leaving. We talked about that last verse in our last lesson. Joseph had instructed his men to put the money back into the bags of grain, and that was done. So the brothers discover that the money is returned, and they became very afraid. They were in fear of jeopardizing the release of Simeon, who was bound right before their eyes and kept in prison, and to be held until they returned again with Benjamin. Everything that happened is shared with Jacob. They go back to Canaan and they share everything that happened with their father Jacob. Now, of course, when the brothers told Jacob, their father, that the only way that they could get Simeon back was to return with Benjamin. And Joseph even said to them that he wouldn't even see them unless they returned with the younger brother Benjamin. So, of course, Jacob refused the plan of sending Benjamin back. He was not going to have another son lost. Again, we talked about these two brothers, Joseph and Benjamin, were the children of his beloved Rachel. So, of course, he was not going to go along with the plan in order to even get Simeon back. He was not willing to let Benjamin go. But they ate the grain that was brought back on that first trip, and the famine becomes severe. Now, the famine was already in Canaan, and that's why they were sent to Egypt to buy grain. But at this point, the famine becomes severe. And Jacob tells them to go again to buy grain. But the thing that he said is to go and buy a little grain. So that kind of meant that, once they ate that grain, they were going to have to return again. But Reuben and Judah, the brothers, reminded Jacob that they could not go before this ruler without their brother Benjamin, because they would lose their life. So they talked about they would lose their life if they stayed in Canaan, because they were going to starve to death. And if they returned to Egypt and didn't have Benjamin, they were going to lose their lives. So they convinced their father to allow Benjamin, the youngest son, to return with them to Egypt to buy grain. Now, Reuben initially said that he would, if he didn't bring Benjamin back, that his sons could be killed. And then Judah said that he would be taken as surety if Benjamin was not allowed to come back. So they convinced the father that they would bring their brother back. So the brothers go before Joseph again, at this time with Benjamin. Joseph tells the house steward to prepare a meal for the brothers to dine with them in the house. And he told them to slay an animal. So this was a big thing in this meal that he was asking to prepare, because most of the time they would do more things, eat more stuff like fish and grains and vegetables. But this time they were told to slay an animal. And so the brothers were really afraid. So they started telling the steward of the house, as they were getting prepared for the meal, they were trying to explain to him that, we brought money, but the money was put back in our sacks. And they just wanted him to make sure that they were honest men, because they didn't know what was going to happen. But anyway, they did prepare for the meal, and the steward was told to set the brothers up according to their age. So this was something that was amazing to the brothers when they realized this. So they were given, after the meal and everything, they were given grain to return. And this time, the money was placed back in the cups. Not only was the money placed in the cups, but a silver cup was placed in Benjamin's cup. So this was a part of Joseph's test for his brothers. So he even told his stewards, as they began to journey out of the city or the town, that they were supposed to go and stop them, to go and go to Benjamin and find, cut that sack open and find that silver cup in that sack, and once they find it, to bring them back. So they did exactly what was told. The cup was found with Benjamin, and then it was told that whoever had the cup in their sack was going to be kept as a slave. So they returned, and Joseph told them that, now he was calling them thieves, but and then that Benjamin was going to have to remain because he was the one that the cup was found in his bag. And by this time, Simeon had already been released during the meal. And so all of the brothers were together at this time. But Judah intercedes on Benjamin's behalf and says that he would remain because he didn't want his father to die, because he knew his father would die if Benjamin did not return. So that brings us to our lesson for this morning. Love prevails over all. Are there any comments or questions before we get started in our lesson? Okay, as we move on, love prevails over all. And the first section, Genesis 45, 1 through 8, begins with an authentic exposure. So verse 1 says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, send everyone away from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. In verse 3, it says, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And they came closer. He said, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. In verse 5, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. So in verse 1 and 2, Joseph was moved by Judah's passion or willingness and his plea to stay there and become the slave in order to allow his brother Benjamin to return home. So Joseph could not restrain himself. I mean, it brought, I'm pretty sure, all the emotions that he had, even probably emotions that have been held for years, but he cried out. He could not hold on any longer. And he demanded that everyone be sent out except for his brothers. And then he began to cry. He wept. And they talk about how loud he wept that, those in the Pharaoh's household heard him and the other Egyptians heard him. So this was a loud cry. Sometimes you just need to get a good cry, a good weeping, and just let it all hang out. And I'm sure rarely do we have a true cry like that to just cleanse ourselves. But this is what Joseph did. So as we move to verse 3, he says to him, and of course, he's still dressed up as in the Egyptian attire. And he says to them, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And this was the third time that Joseph has asked his brothers about about their father, and now is his father alive? And before the brothers came back to Egypt the second time to get grain, there was some time that had passed between that, because as I mentioned earlier, they had eaten all of the pretty much all of their grain, and so that's why they were sending for grain again. But the brothers were pleading with Joseph, I mean with their father, saying, if you had not stalled, and if you had not procrastinated, we could have gone to Egypt and been back two times with grain. But because he didn't want to send Benjamin, the father was procrastinating. So Joseph was asking again, because since this time has passed, he didn't know whether the father was still alive. So he asked the question again, but he says it in, he personalized it. Is my father still alive? But of course, if somebody's looking at a ruler dressed up in Egyptian attire, who had previously had an interpreter, and who his brothers, of course, Hebrew, speaking the Hebrew language, and he just continued with that charade as if he didn't understand them. So they're kind of confused, and more so confused. That says dismayed. They're troubled in this presence, trying to understand this person saying that I am Joseph, and is my father still alive? But then Joseph, in verse 4, he gives them proof of who he was. Joseph said, come closer to me. And they did just that. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. So there was no question about it at this point in time who Joseph was, because no one else would have known that they sold their brother Joseph into Egypt. So this was the final proof for them to understand who Joseph was. So any comments, any questions before we move on? I'm just telling the story. So no comments. Okay.
No, I want to go back to the meal when they were prepared and he had all of them according to their birth. But in that meal, Benjamin was kind of like um, one of the ones that were most aware, because the meal was prepared was a Hebrew meal, and he was wondering why. That's all the question. But the brother was kept telling them to be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. When you do extra study into it, and it goes to show that Benjamin was trying. I mean, Joseph was trying to get them to see, and how many of them, how they failed to see that they was actually eating a Hebrew dish, delicacy, and so they didn't even recognize nobody but Benjamin, and so those other brothers, those other 10 brothers, were still acting the same way at that particular point. But the deal was with Judah, because he was so compassionate towards his father. That is one of the reasons why, if you go in a little further, that Judah was chosen to be the tribe for the Messiah to come through, because of his compassion, because of his love that he expressed at this particular point, when he got ready to get, wanted to keep Benjamin, but he couldn't stand it. So he spoke out, and that is said to be one of the most moving verses in the book of Genesis. And if you get a chance, go back and read it.
Thank you, Pastor. So as he talked about that particular meal, the brothers actually thought that he had, powers, because of the fact that they were seated. I didn't go into that part, but because of the fact that they were seated according to their birth, they thought that this, like, that Joseph, this ruler, had had powers to understand things. They call it divination, and like sorcerers and doing things like that. And the other thing was the fact that the silver cup was the in Benjamin's sack. They also talked about divination in that. So they felt like this person, had powers that they didn't understand or didn't have. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Okay, as we move on to verse 5, here Joseph tells them, not to be upset, not to be angry with yourselves. Don't be upset because you sold me here. Now, Joseph had every right to be upset, to be bitter, to be angry with his brothers. And, in the previous lesson, last week, we even talked about the fact that, seeing this person or these persons that did you wrong for the first time, when you see them, that something starts to turning in that stomach, or you start feeling those those feelings of anger rising back up. But here he wept, and like I was sharing, I'm sure he released a lot of that as he wept before he revealed who he was. But then in verse as I was saying, in verse 5, he says, don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. He says, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Now, we talk so often about, scriptures, and we repeat that, where the enemy meant it for our bad, God meant it for our good. Now, here's a part of that in this. He's got, Joseph is letting his brothers know that even though you sold me in to slavery, this was not your doing. This was God's doing. So it kind of took the power from them that that they did this. And he was trying to let them know to don't be angry, that this was a part of God's plan, that I'm here. And he not only sent me here as a part of his plan, but he sent me here to preserve life. Because as I shared earlier, if the brothers stayed with their father and their family in Canaan, they were going to die because the famine was severe. And then they were also saying that if we go, we're going to die. If we go without Benjamin, we're going to die. But here Joseph is saying that I've been here, I've been sent here. And everything that I was doing, it wasn't necessarily, he didn't know at that time that it was for his family, because he thought, he was no longer, they were gone. It's been 20 years and he had no contact with his family. So the family in Egypt was his family. So he said, that God sent me here. So this was revealed to him by God, that God sent him here to preserve life. Because as the pastor was talking about Judah, Jesus Christ came through the line of Judah. So when we're talking about preserving life, when we're talking about preserving a remnant, this is what is being talked about here. He said in verse 6, for the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. He said in verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So, like I said, he's saying that well, let me go back to verse 6, because in verse 6, he was saying that this goes back to the revelation through Pharaoh's dream, that there would be, of course, 7 years of famine. And this is what they had. They were already into 2 years and had 5 years left. And then in verse 7, the remnant refers to the believing, faithful portion of the Hebrew people. And so a remnant of them had to be saved, because, as I said, this is through Judah, Jesus Christ came through that line. So even though um, they all at Canaan could have perished, everyone could have perished but God. But because of God's plan, this did not happen. So God sent Jesus. And I want you to think about it. He sent Jesus so that we would not perish. So Judah, as I mentioned, came through the line of Jesus Christ. And we're so thankful that God sent his only begotten son, Jesus Christ, so that we wouldn't perish. But this is where it begins with the Hebrew family, where this remnant is saved, so that the generations after could, as they say, this one begot this one and begot, until we got down to Jesus Christ, our Savior. Any comments or any questions? I'm like Pastor
First
now. I'm
Lady,
like quiet this morning. Go ahead.
um, in the bottom of our lesson on page 77, it still kind of brings back to, well, let's go to 76, and it say
Don't go there
Job.
yet. Don't go to the think about it yet. I'm coming with that.
Okay, so well, let me just go ahead and just bring my eyes out what I was thinking. If you look at
Okay.
77, at
Mm-hmm.
first, at the bottom it said, at first his focus was neither on himself nor the injustice he suffered. So his attention was on his father. And I'm going there. So, when I read that, it put me in the mind of Christ. You know,
Mm-hmm.
everything that happened to Christ. And we know that the power and authority that he had. We know that what the power and authority that Joseph had.
Right.
Joseph could have used that power and authority and say, you know what, I'm not giving y'all nothing,
Right.
because of how they treated him. And as believers, some of our attitude are like that, because the way you treated me, I'm not going to do this and that. But Joseph portrayed that love that Christ had, because his focus was not on him.
Right.
Joseph's focus was on his father.
Mm-hmm.
Christ's focus was on his father. So
Absolutely.
something out where I read, I don't know whether or not it's in the lesson, but it say Joseph had to choose between bitterness and moving forward in purpose. So Joseph
Right.
realized he had a purpose. Whenever we realize we have a purpose, come what may, this is the choice we have. We can continue to be bitter, because if we're bitter, we won't be able to go forward. So Joseph's focus was not so of himself; it was so much on his father, and that's what came into my spirit. He showed the perfect picture of the love that the Father has for all of us.
Yes, and you see through Joseph, we see true forgiveness early in the scriptures. We see him exemplifying the love of God. And in the last lesson, it talks about, he said that he fears God. And we should fear God in reverence of him, and want to do the right thing, want to show love, want to forgive, want to be like Jesus Christ, because of what God so loved us that he sent his son. And his son, we all know died for us, went through excruciating pain and beating and, dying on the cross. But he did it all because it was what his father had planned for him to do. And he said it clear, not my will, but let your will be done. If it's your will, take this cup from me, but it's not my will. Let your will be done.
Sister
Thank
Ellen,
you, Minister.
can we go back since you kind of brought love back into it again? Because you mentioned something early on about loving yourself or being able to love yourself so you can be able to love others. So,
Hmm.
how today, as Christians, do you think that is part of some of our issues today that we still have not yet learned to love ourselves and forgive ourselves so we can move? Or is that still a hindrance for us to move forward toward plans that God has for us? Because you mentioned earlier about loving yourself.
Yeah. I do believe, it can hold us in bondage because if we're hurt, if we've been through trauma, we've been through grief, we've been through pains, which all of us have, as I mentioned, but some of us can move forward. But some people stay in that same place of unforgiveness. And then, if you've heard it before, they say hurt people hurt people. So if you're hurt, then you're going to hurt somebody else. You want someone else to feel the pain that you've been through, but until you can move forward, and even if some wrong was done to you, and ask for forgiveness or forgive that person, whether you say it directly to them or not, because your actions are going to show whether or not you forgive someone. So if you can say to them you forgive them for what they did, then that's great. But there's times where you can't say that you forgive them, or they aren't available for you to say it. But when you, just like when we talked about Joseph, when Joseph cried, this wasn't just a cry. It was more. It was a cry from deep within. So we can imagine that through that cry, that pain was lifted from him. So if we don't move on from the hurt and the pain and allow God to heal us from those hurt and pain, then we cannot be empowered to love one another. And so it did say in the beginning, it empowers us to love ourselves so we can love God and others in return. And that was talking about um, the pain and stuff that we have gone through. It purges the soul of the stains left behind. God's love does that. It said it purges the soul of the stains left behind by the trauma, grief, the hurt, and the pains of life. So then that love empowers us to love ourselves so we can love God and others in return.
Also, Sister Amy, that I'm going back to 1 John 5:4 on this morning, either 18:1, 4 and 18, but it was talking about these anxieties and how they torment us, and actually cause us to be in a worse place than we're supposed to be in, because we are holding that grudge, we are holding this against somebody, and what it does, it torments us just like the devil torment, when that kind of thing. So we have to remove ourselves from that position and get in a position of love, where then God can erase the pain and the hurt so that we can forgive our brother man. Because if you don't forgive and allow that stuff to continue to linger in, what's going to happen is going to get worse and worse. So in a time like we're living in now, don't know, death is around the corner. Family members die. We can't go to the funeral. We can't do this here. So this is the time, and especially close lesson to close on in this particular arena that we're in, is for families to come together and be united and let all that nonsense go.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have any comments or questions?
I would just love to go back to when Joseph told them, made them aware that they knew who Joseph were, that he immediately, in that sixth verse, he immediately went, in that fifth verse, and told them, and now do not be distressed. Immediately he wanted them to, relax. I don't want you to feel like you the reason I'm here. It was God placing me here. And so
Right.
he wanted to get that clear with them. Put that behind you. I have put it
Right.
behind me. And
Yeah. And move forward.
move forward.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what he was saying. I'm putting all the, he didn't say it, but that's what his action showed, that he was
Right.
putting all that
behind.
pain behind him. And, I love my family. This is Joseph who you sold into slavery. But as Minister Bird said, he wanted to, he was concerned about his father and his family. He wanted to see his father before his father died. So as we move on to verse 8,
Wait a minute, Sister Alexander.
okay.
Going back to verse 2, when he said he wept so loudly, that was his point of letting it go right there.
Mm-hmm.
And getting, as my wife said, and getting all that stuff out of him. That when he forgave, that was that point where he actually forgave his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
When he went to that, because after that he started telling them to come closer, because he said you got to release that stuff. You don't, like I said, you're gonna be tormented by it. And what I mean by tormented, it's gonna haunt you. It's gonna haunt you, and it's gonna get into your system. Then the next thing you know, you're gonna start being bitter and angry with everybody that come around, and then nobody don't want to be around you.
Well, the brothers kept this secret and for all these
20
years,
years.
and they knew, I'm sure they felt, that pain. And all of that again came up right before their face. As soon as the brother told them that this is Joseph, your brother that you sold
So
into slavery, I'm sure all of the memories came back up that of what they did. And they're going through this because of what they did. But Joseph was assuring them that you don't have to be you don't have to be concerned, you don't have to be angry, because it was not your doing. God, this is God's doing. So in verse 8, Joseph expresses that God has made him chief counselor. He is not boasting, he is just revealing. Because I thought about that. I was thinking, the brothers could have thought, well, here he is boasting again, as he boasted through those dreams. But he's not boasting, he's just revealing the miracle that God had placed him in a position of authority to save the family, to save his father from all of them, the whole family dying from the famine. So this is what he was expressing in verse 8. And then as we move on to the next section, the bigger picture. Um, Now, in verse 9 is not in our book, but is not in our lesson, but in verse 9, Joseph sends for Jacob, his father, and everyone to come to Egypt. And then on page 78 in our lesson, it says Joseph stressed with emphasis in verse 8 that his brothers were not ultimately responsible for his enslavement. Rather, it was God's doing for a purpose that transcended their cruel intent. While Joseph did not absolve them, which meant that it didn't free them of their guilt. It says that it did not absolve them of their actions with his declaration. He instead looked to the bigger purpose of God's plan for his life to save others. So even with us, when we are trying to go out and teach the word of God, when we're going out and living the word of God and teaching others and about this salvation, the good news, it's not for us, it's for kingdom, it's kingdom building. And we're doing it so that because God word says that he don't want any to perish. And then His will is for none to perish. And then the last paragraph on page 78 says the reaction of the brothers was a typical reaction of those who have purposely injured another after encountering the wounded party. Often those who are offenders look in amazement, thinking, is this so? Is it possible? They should be dead. However, as Joseph pointed out, the difficulties we face are at times larger than ourselves. Those who intentionally harm us act within the permissive will of God. It is not God's perfect will, but may be permitted by God because ultimately He knows His plans for us. So we're going to move on. I know my time is running out. So the bigger picture begins with verse 10 through 15. And I'll do, instead of reading those scriptures, I'll go through these scriptures and explain. And in verse 10, um, they Joseph is telling them where they're going to settle, and they were going to settle in a land called Goshen, and Goshen was near to Canaan, and it was also near to Egypt. And this particular land of of Goshen, it was the livestock producing area of Egypt. So here it is. It was a land of plenty and a land of comfort. So here he was bringing his family to still a good place, one of the best places in Egypt. And prior to this, Joseph told his family and his brothers when they come back to say that they were shepherds. And, because here Joseph was over the land, and the land was able to, over the grains and all, they were able to store so much grain. So even Pharaoh was in agreement because they were they were ones that knew how to do raise livestock and they were good with it. So here it was, even in a time of famine, they were still getting good land. They were still being able to get to the livestock would be able to be produced in this area. And that made me think about the pandemic. Even though we're going through a pandemic, we still have people that are eating. Food is coming from nobody should be starving, because food is plentiful even in this pandemic. And then verse 11 goes on to say that I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. Their provision was being made. And if we trust God, provision is being made and will continue to be made right now during this pandemic. In verse 12, he talks about, he said, and now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks this. So, as I said before, that there was an interpreter with Joseph and his brothers when they ate together, but he's speaking in Hebrew. He's speaking in the land that the language that they understand. No interpreter was needed. And he has the authority by speaking from his mouth for them to come and live near him. Also, Benjamin, his dear brother, had no part in this in his plan, in that plan that the brothers conspired to have him sent into Egypt and to become a slave. But here, Benjamin is surety, because Benjamin was not involved with it. He was saying, go back and tell my father my words. Tell them that I am in authority. Tell them what you've seen. And the father was going to believe Benjamin because Benjamin was not a part of it. So he's saying in verse 12, and now your eyes have seen it, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, he sees it. He sees that and here's this. out of my own mouth that I speak this. In verse 13, he's telling of the goodness. He's sharing, you must tell your father how greatly I am honored in Egypt. And all of that you have seen, hurry and bring my father down here. As they were said, his concern left. He was no longer concerned about the evil that was done to them. He was concerned about getting his father in a place of safety, in a place of in a good land, Goshen, in a place where there's plenty, in a place where there's comfort. Bring my father so that I can see, him. And then as we move on, I know that I mentioned to Minister Bird that I was going to go back to think it on page 76. And it said, Joseph prefigured Christ. Like Christ, he was beloved by his father and rejected by his family. Though not with the same impact, he too ultimately rose to power and brought salvation to his people and others as a result of his suffering. Jesus Christ suffered for us, but through his suffering, we have salvation. Joseph suffered, but through his suffering, his that remnant was able to live, and he was able to bring them to a place of forgiveness. In verse 14, he expressed these are expressions of love and happiness. It says, then he fell upon his brothers, Benjamin's neck, and wept. I mean, just imagine, as he continued to show his love and gratitude for seeing his brother, he just wept on his brother Benjamin's neck. And then not only that, it was reciprocated. Benjamin, who had not known his brother in 20 years, Benjamin wept as well. The love between the two of them, because I'm sure Jacob talked so much about his big brother Joseph that that was he believed was killed, but here he is able to embrace his brother that his father loved so much, that he was able to embrace the other child that his mother, that even Benjamin never saw. He was able to embrace his brother, the two of them from the same beloved Rachel. So here in verse 15, then he went on to kiss his brothers, and he wept on them as well. And after that, it says that he and his brothers, they talked. So there was time for them to reconcile. It doesn't talk about the conversation that was discussed, but it did say that they talked. So, once all of that pain, the trauma that he went through, once all of that hurt, the bitterness, all of that was removed, then they were able to cry together and they were able to talk. And we can see that in families. Once you forgive someone, once you've cried over it, then you too, you can have conversations. At other times, you don't even want to be around them. You walk the other way. You find reasons to avoid them. You don't want to talk to them. You don't want to see them, whether it's in the family or the body of Christ, or whether it's in a natural family. If you have not forgiven them, then you avoid them. But here, they wept together and they had conversation. So does anybody have any comments or questions before we close out?
Sister Van, I would just love to share a portion of the conclusion in my commentary. And it says here, don't be angry with yourselves. Imagine yourself standing before Jesus, who has asked you to draw near, as Joseph told his brothers to draw near to him. Jesus speaks and says, I am Jesus, whom you crucified. Your sins are the reason I gave my life as a sacrifice on the cross. But don't be angry with yourself. I want to forgive you, not condemn you. Jesus says, Jesus does indeed say this, and he means it. And it also says God has revealed his love to us. Are we
Yes.
willing? Are we revealing it to others? So just let it be known, Joseph was there. This is Jesus Christ. These are the reason he went to the cross. We sinned. We committed these different things and stuff like that. But he was willing to go and give his life for us. And let it be known you don't have to be angry with yourself, but just come to me and I will rescue you. That would be my.
Okay. Thank you. And we have a responsibility and an obligation and and a responsibility to reciprocate the love that Jesus Christ has shown us. Because this is what happened between the brothers. They reciprocated the love. And as we close out, um,